Behind every fortress of war, there was a garden of peace, a quiet, walled paradise where nobles and servants worked side by side, growing food, mixing medicine, and chasing the lost scent of Eden. Most history books never mention it, but these medieval gardens were more than decoration. They were survival, devotion, and hope, all rooted in soil. Let's step inside one and uncover the world that kept medieval life alive. If you stood outside a medieval castle at dawn, the first thing you'd notice might not be its gray stone towers or its defensive walls. You'd likely smell something, faint but distinct. The sharp, resinous scent of rosemary, the sweetness of crushed mint, the earthy undertone of damp soil after a long night's dew. Behind the heavy masonry and the noise of daily life, there was often another world, green, enclosed, and deliberately hidden. While the knights prepared for battle and the servants clattered about their duties, someone was tending to the castle's heart, the garden. These gardens, forgotten by most modern imaginations, were spaces of life and quiet industry. In the Middle Ages, the garden was not merely decoration, it was the noble's connection to the earth. A symbol of order amidst chaos, and quite often, a place of medicine, food, and meditation for the medieval noble. Life within a castle could be harsh and monotonous. The great hall was dark, the air thick with smoke from torches and the smell of salted meat. Outside, the landscape was unpredictable, forests filled with bandits or wolves, and distant villages that owed fealty but could not always be trusted. Yet within the enclosed garden, the hortus conclusus, there was something profoundly different. The phrase hortus conclusus, meaning closed garden, comes from both practical and spiritual roots. Practically, the high walls kept out animals, thieves, and the relentless winds that swept across medieval plains. Symbolically, the enclosure reflected paradise, an echo of Eden, a microcosm of the perfect divine order that humankind had lost but longed to rebuild. Step inside one of these medieval gardens, and the contrast from the outside world would be immediate. The ground was divided into geometric plots, bordered by small fences of woven willow or low hedges of boxwood. Gravel or brick paths connected each bed in neat lines. The order wasn't accidental. Geometry, symmetry, and pattern all reflected a spiritual idea that the universe itself was structured by divine design. To cultivate a garden was to mirror that sacred balance. You would hear the hum of bees gathering nectar from lavender and sage. The trickle of water from a small stone fountain might fill the silence. Birds fluttered above, occasionally settling on an apple branch or a trellis of climbing roses. Most people imagine castles as gray and lifeless, but within their walls, color thrived. Calendula, golden orange marigolds, glowed in the sun. Deep purple violets lined the shaded edges of the garden. Bright red poppies nodded in the wind beside silver green herbs. And everywhere, the lush green of cabbages, leeks, and chard filled the air with a clean, faintly pungent scent. These gardens served many purposes. First and foremost, they were practical. Long before modern medicine, people turned to plants for healing. Every noble household maintained what was known as a physic garden, a collection of medicinal herbs, carefully cultivated and labeled. Here you'd find yarrow for wounds, comfrey for broken bones, and valerian for sleepless nights. Sage was said to strengthen memory, rosemary to ward off illness, and rue to drive away evil spirits. The lady of the house, often educated in herbal lore, might spend hours instructing her servants on how to dry, crush, or steep these herbs. A few centuries earlier, much of this knowledge had been preserved in monasteries. Monks kept detailed manuals on plant care and remedies, blending ancient Roman wisdom with Christian philosophy. Over time, this monastic expertise trickled into noble estates. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the castle garden had become a quiet center of medical practice. And yet, the garden was not only a hospital, it was a kitchen too. The same beds that yielded medicinal herbs also produced food. Medieval cooking relied heavily on what could be grown nearby. Onions, garlic, parsley, dill, and leeks were indispensable. Peas and beans were common in soups, while lettuce and cress might appear in salads during the short, bright weeks of summer. Fruit trees stood along the walls, apples, pears, plums, carefully trained to grow flat against the stone to conserve space and capture warmth. Grapevines sometimes climbed wooden frames, producing small clusters used for both wine and vinegar. You might even see exotic plants that hinted at distant trade. Saffron from Spain, figs from the south of France, or imported seeds from Italy or beyond. The noble garden was a living record of Europe's connections, a quiet symbol of global exchange long before the word globalization existed. And amid all this practicality, there was beauty. Roses, lily, and irises filled spaces not for utility, but for contemplation. Their meaning ran deep. The rose was sacred to the Virgin Mary, the lily to purity, and the iris to faith and wisdom. Walking among these flowers wasn't mere recreation. It was a devotional act. For many nobles, especially women, the garden offered rare solitude. The outer world of politics and war belonged to men. The garden, enclosed and peaceful, belonged to women. Here, noblewomen could walk without escort, think without interruption, and find small peace within the chaos of feudal life. Historical letters and illuminated manuscripts show this vividly. Ladies plucking flowers into baskets, reading psalms under the shade of apple trees, or feeding doves that cooed along the garden walls. These quiet scenes spoke volumes about how medieval people imagined virtue and refinement, not through dominance or wealth, but through cultivation, patience, and harmony with nature. Yet this tranquility was built on labor, and lots of it. The noble's serene stroll among herbs was made possible by gardeners who toiled daily. They dug, weeded, watered, and composted, following rhythms as steady as the changing light. These gardeners were often skilled craftsmen, trained by monastic or royal estates. Some were former peasants elevated by their expertise. Others were bound to the land by feudal duty. In many records, their names are lost, replaced by phrases like Custos Horti, keeper of the garden. But their fingerprints remain in every trench and furrow that once fed an entire castle. The soil was life itself, and managing it was a science born of patience. Compost was made from kitchen scraps, straw, and manure, turned carefully over months. Gardeners understood which herbs thrived in shade, which needed sun, which would wilt if overwatered, and which could survive frost in an age when famine was always near. This knowledge was invaluable, but the garden also had another, subtler function. It was a performance of power. A nobleman's garden was as much about display as sustenance. Guests arriving at a castle might be led through the garden to admire its order and abundance. Every neat hedge and blooming flower whispered a message. This household was disciplined, prosperous, and civilized, in a world where most peasants lived amid mud and hunger. The ability to grow beauty, to make the earth yield color and fragrance, was a mark of superiority. Still, despite its grandeur, the noble garden was fragile. One harsh winter could kill the herbs. One siege could trample the orchard. And so, many castles kept small greenhouses or warming rooms, simple wooden structures lined with oiled parchment to trap heat. Within these, rare plants or seedlings could survive the cold. Gardens also reflected religion in subtle ways. Many were laid out in 4 equal parts, symbolizing the 4 rivers of Eden described in Genesis. At the center might stand a fountain or a well, representing the source of life. Around it, paths radiated outward, sometimes forming crosses. Gardening itself was seen as a moral act, an imitation of divine creation, a reminder of humanity's lost paradise and its hope for redemption. But not all gardens were solemn. Some were lively spaces filled with laughter and song. During feast days or mild evenings, nobles dined outdoors, sitting beneath vine-covered pergolas as musicians played soft tunes. Servants carried platters of roasted meats, fresh bread, and wine chilled in spring water. Imagine that scene. Candles flickering in the dusk, a faint breeze stirring the leaves, and the mingling scent of rosemary smoke from the kitchen fires. The world outside the walls could be violent and unpredictable, but here, at least for a few hours, there was peace. The noble garden was also a site of education. Young heirs were taught to observe nature's patterns, the turning of seasons, the growth of crops, the discipline of tending life. Priests used gardens to teach moral lessons. Weeds represented sin. Flowers symbolized virtue. The act of pruning was likened to confession, of watering to grace. Over centuries, these metaphors took root not only in religion, but in language itself. The English word culture, after all, comes from the Latin colere, to cultivate. To be cultured was quite literally to know how to tend the soil. Even courtly love, that idealized, poetic devotion so central to medieval romance, often took place in gardens. Lovers in illuminated manuscripts exchanged glances beneath trellises of roses or exchanged tokens beside a fountain. To the medieval imagination, the garden was the natural setting for both temptation and purity, a place where emotions, like plants, could either bloom or wither. And yet, as centuries passed, the nature of these gardens began to change. By the late 15th century, the medieval hortus conclusus evolved into something larger and more ornamental. Castles gave way to manor houses. Fortresses became estates. Peace allowed for leisure, and leisure transformed the purpose of gardens. What was once enclosed and practical became open and decorative. Italian and French influences introduced terraces, fountains, and labyrinths. Nobles began hiring professional designers. The humble herb beds of medieval wives expanded into elaborate landscapes designed for display. Geometry remained, but now it was a matter of art, not theology. Still, traces of the old spirit endured. Even in the grand gardens of the Renaissance, you could find a corner devoted to herbs or a quiet bench surrounded by medicinal plants, small echoes of an earlier, more intimate time. Today, very few of those medieval gardens survive. Their fences have long rotted, their soil repurposed, their layouts buried beneath later architecture. But archaeologists have found traces, the outline of beds, seeds preserved in ancient dung pits, pollen caught in the soil. From these fragments, historians have reconstructed glimpses of a world that once bloomed behind every castle wall. If you visit some restored sites, like the gardens of the Château de Villandry in France, or the recreated monastic gardens at the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, you can walk among living history. The plants you see there are the same ones that perfumed medieval courtyards: lavender, sage, rue, fennel, and sweet violet. The same scents that once drifted through the lives of kings and queens, servants and healers alike. And as you walk, you might realize how little has truly changed. The rhythm of planting, the quiet satisfaction of growth, the humility before weather and time. These are as old as humanity itself. The medieval noble's garden was not only a space of survival or beauty. It was a reflection of something deeply human, the need to shape chaos into meaning. Behind every wall, amid war and politics, people still sought connection to the living earth. They touched the soil, inhaled the scent of mint and rose, and remembered, perhaps unconsciously, that paradise, even in a small and fragile form, could be made by hand. When we think of castles, we often picture stone and steel, not petals and stems. But if you listen closely, past the clang of armor and the echo of feasts, you might hear the quieter sounds that filled those walls. The creak of a watering can, the buzz of bees, the soft snip of shears on a rose branch. Those sounds, faint and ordinary, were the true heartbeat of the castle. And though centuries have passed, the story remains the same, even in the hardest of times. People looked for ways to cultivate a small piece of peace, a reminder that beauty and survival often bloom from the same soil. So next time you pass a garden, imagine what might have grown behind those medieval walls, the colors, the scents, the labor, and the quiet devotion that turned stone fortresses into places of unexpected life. Because long before the world learned to industrialize, before cities overtook fields, and before nature became something apart from daily living, there were the castle gardens, those hidden, green sanctuaries where history's most ordinary miracle quietly unfolded. The steady persistence of things that grow, if you've made it this far. Thank you for wandering through history with me tonight. The stories may be quiet, but the past is never truly asleep. It's just waiting for someone curious enough to listen. If you enjoyed this slow walk through forgotten times, I'd love for you to stay a little longer. Click like to let the algorithm know you enjoy calm history. And subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep so you can drift off with more gentle stories from the past. Until next time, rest well, dream softly, and remember, even the most ordinary moments in history had their own quiet beauty. Good night.